welcome to another Texas In Conversation. I'm Maria Merchant, and I'm the Product Marketing Manager for Distribution at Texas. Today, we'll be speaking with Todd Boone, Director of Product Management at Fetch Robotics, to discuss the impact of automation in the distribution and 3PL industries. Automating the movement of materials is dependent on the layout of a facility and the operational elements like technology in order to optimize the warehouse space. In this conversation, we'll examine warehouse design components to consider when looking at automation, which challenges to expect, and how to overcome them. So, thanks for joining me today, Todd. Before we dive into our conversation, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about Fetch Robotics?
First off, thanks for having me. So as you mentioned, Todd Boone, Director of Product Management here at Fetch. And actually, initially, I came from the Zebra side of the business. And we started looking at Fetch and partnering with Fetch in 2019. And in fact, what we were attracted to about them was really a broad breadth of AMR, so autonomous mobile robot platforms and technologies that they brought to market. And Fetch has been around for a number of years. We tend to think of AMRs as very recent, but Fetch actually was founded in 2014, founded by a lady by the name of Melanie Wise, who's very well known actually within the automation and robotics industry. She actually just won I believe it's the Engelberg Award, and it's for it's almost like the Nobel Peace Prize in robotics and automation. And, in many respects, she was the founder of the robotics operating system, helped write that and introduce it into the industry. And so there was there's been a lot of heritage with Fetch Robotics. So on the one hand, it's been around for approximately 8 years. On the other hand, it really brings a breadth of both capability as well as now products and solutions into the market. One thing that you may not know is that Fetch was acquired by Zebra Technologies in 2021. As I mentioned, we started partnering with Fetch in 2019, we were impressed with the overall company, with the overall technology, with the talent and the overall team that they brought to the table. And so as we started to dip more deeply into the automation market, it became clearer and clearer that Fetch was actually an obvious choice for us to start, and get a head start, I might say, on our robotics and automation business by actually acquiring Fetch Robotics. And so now it is a wholly owned portion of Zebra, and we've set it up in a sense where it's a business unit now within Zebra with an exclusive focus on robotics and automation solutions.
Fantastic. Very exciting stuff for us because Zebra has been a Texas partner for a very, very long time. So we're really excited about what's ahead. So, Todd, tell me, what's your take on automation? I mean, how is it going to affect distributors and 3PLs, and how is it going to affect the way they serve their customers?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Because automation in many respects is a response to things that are going on in the marketplace right now. And if I take a step back and I start thinking about some of the Zebra solutions that we've been building over the last few years, we started coming out with some workflow solutions, very focused and targeted on the mobile worker, as you might expect, because Zebra makes handheld, mobile devices and scanners and printers and all those types of things to enable the mobile worker. And a lot of those solutions actually have a pretty profound impact on our customers. And we'd come out, and you may have heard of Fulfillment Edge, right? And we actually came out with that and documented about a 24% typical ROI for customers that would deploy it. And what was really interesting is as they looked at that, they said, that's not enough. We need more than this. And where they were seeing more was actually automation and robotics types of solutions. And the reason that they needed more is although equipping the workers and providing them with these new solutions was certainly, scratching part of the itch, if you will, it wasn't actually enabling them to increase capacity as much as they needed, but also deal with really what's being, I wouldn't call it a shrinking but a capacity constrained labor market. And so, it became this interesting dynamic, right? Because when you look at it, and I think if you go back 2, 3 years, um, if you were to talk about automation and robotics, a lot of people saw that as a threat to the jobs that were within any given industry, right? Like we were thinking of, warehousing, 3PLs, distribution, and those types of things. But, when you go back historically, even, there was always this threat of, hey, the machines are going to come and take my job.
Yeah.
Now more and more customers that we're talking to are saying, I don't have enough people. The people I have, I can't keep because it's like a revolving door. In fact, we're actually involved with one customer right now, and the team is at a facility. Actually, so this is news to me even as of today. And just keep this in mind of that they have about 25 pickers within a facility, and they have had 140 headcount turnover since 2020.
Wow.
And so you think of the challenges that the 3PLs and the distributors are facing, and for them to just be able to run their operations effectively has been a massive challenge. And then I think combined and additive to that is the fact that the e-commerce market is doing nothing, right, other than accelerate even faster. And it's an interesting dynamic because I think we've all just been through this interesting 2 years of this COVID pandemic. And I think if anything, what's really intriguing about it is that with everyone staying home, they didn't stop purchasing. They just started purchasing more online. And so now they needed mechanisms to be able to, and by they, I mean our customers, our distributors, our 3PLs, they needed mechanisms to be able to increase their capacity in this labor constrained market, and also within this realm of suddenly things like 2 or 3 hour turnarounds are not isolated. People are starting to expect these service level agreements, right? Like Amazon has kind of changed the game, and now you're hearing of delivery services with 30 and 60-minute type of delivery windows. And so there's this stream of elements that are I think impacting the distributor and the 3PL market that is really forcing them in many respects to look at automation in ways that they maybe were not even as close as 2019. And so it's really changed, I think, the dynamic. It's changed how they're looking at it. I mean, and when we think of warehousing and distribution, I mean, let's be honest, notoriously slow, historically, to adopt new technologies. But I think even these new market dynamics are really flipping that on its head, right? And it's going to have them actually invest, and we're already seeing it, right? They're already investing in these types of technologies and capabilities much quicker.
For sure. And for it to be a game changer, I mean, that's a big one. So, do you see the use of autonomous mobile robots, AMRs, more common in particular industries within distribution and 3PL, so really micro industries?
Um, yeah, I mean, it depends really. Like, so AMRs, I think, definitely have a nice play with, more generalized retailers, if you will, right? Like, if you think of like food and beverage and food services, like groceries, rather, a lot of times it's perhaps not as good a fit if we kind of peel back the onion a little bit more, right? In terms of the types of products that they're distributing, the size of the products, and all those types of things. And so a lot of times it's more of that general merchandise e-commerce retailer that's looking for this type of capability to extend, their capacity realistically. But by the same token, they've also got some challenges with that, right? Because it's been, in many respects, if you look at the early deployments, a lot of them were very focused on apparel and those types of small, very light types of items. And some of that was based off even just the available technologies for them, right? And so if you think of an AMR platform, how much can it carry? Like not just the weight load, but even the size load and those types of things. And so I think it has stayed within those general sort of merchandise areas, but I think and that's been somewhat limiting. I think it will extend further because what you'll also start to see in the industry is those platforms start to extend in terms of their capacity, both size and weight, and all those types of elements that will enable customers to actually unlock more than what they're doing today. But I think one other thing that maybe doesn't get enough um, airtime within the spaces. We're seeing a ton of interest with customers for non-fulfillment type of applications in this as well, right? Like we tend to think of automation and the 3PLs, and we think of e-commerce fulfillment and all those elements. But realistically, there's just a lot of jobs that, either they don't have the people to do them, or when they do get the people, they don't want to do them. And so, strangely enough, and I'll be honest, I was a skeptic when I first heard it, but actually, dunnage, so waste removal within a facility. But actually, when you think of it, that type of capacity. I mean, a lot of facilities have skids and cases and packaging and all these things that you don't want the pickers randomly wandering around going too far to discard of the waste, and you also don't want your facility to become a mess. So they tend to get put into specific areas, and then somebody typically goes and actually removes that. And we have solutions, for example, that just automate that entire cycle so that you don't have a person doing that. And so it's interesting, right? Because I think within the industry, and that's whether it's in more of a manufacturing environment, that could be a warehousing 3PL. And so I think what we're seeing is that people are looking at automation and saying, where are the jobs that people either, and as I said before, don't want to do, or we just can't get the labor? Because when I get that person to remove that trash, they stick around for a week and say, this is horrible, and they go back to, doing something else, and it's really hard from a retention standpoint. And so, there's this old saying, in terms of the dirty, or, the jobs that people just don't want to do, but it's somewhat true, right? Like we get machines to help us throughout daily life for things that we might not want to do. And, I think there's more examples that we'll start to see that will actually broaden, how AMRs are seen throughout that warehousing and distribution environment.
So, when we look at a warehouse and design, what are the major warehouse design components that you need to consider or one should consider when looking at automation?
So this is, a really interesting one on many levels. There's all sorts of different automation technologies, right, that are available. And, there's the whole greenfield, brownfield type of discussion, right? And so for customers that are opening up a greenfield site, they probably have a lot more options in terms of how they're going to utilize automation. I think for this question, I'll focus more on the brownfield because most of our customers have a bunch of facilities that they've already invested in. Um, in many cities right now, there's not a lot of extra square footage available anyway. So even to build is becoming more and more challenging because warehousing square footage is just, at an absolute premium as well. So now when you say, okay, so here's these investments that these customers have already made, both in sort of the capital, the facility itself, as well as all the technology investments within, I think the major design considerations is how do you leverage that, as much as possible. And so one approach to that is to say, hey, can we reutilize both the facility as it is, right, as well as the layout within that facility as much as possible, and bring in automation to make people's lives easier. But I think where one mistake is made, though, is often that there's a hope that this could be done without changing anything operationally. And I think that's where, it really starts to get important to be thinking about how do you zone, right? And it's not just this random, hey, zoning for automation. I think it's zoning to the approach of automation. And by that, so I'll just sort of build that out a little bit more. We offer a couple different ways that so and I'm talking more fulfillment here, right? So we have a fulfillment platform called FlexShelf, and it has, screens on that robot platform that you can instruct the worker by, right? So it's a robot only type of approach. And so when you utilize that type of methodology and you're having workers pick through a warehouse, you have to have effectively a density of both the robots and the workers in one location, or in a broad location, so that you don't have workers looking for robots randomly trying to find some work to do, and you don't have AMRs and robots left stranded elsewhere in the facility, and you're just not going to get the facility gains that you need. So you almost have to step them through the flow of that facility, One of our competitors has come up with the term swarm, right? And actually, it is a pretty good, analogy because you can think of this work that's kind of swarming through the warehouse. But then other ways that we actually can do this is, of course, we're Zebra. We've got mobile devices and scanners and all those types of things. And so we can equip the worker. And so rather than just exclusively getting their instructions from the AMR, they can also be getting their instructions from one of our Zebra devices. And what changes there, though, again, if you were to just swarm through the warehouse, frankly, that device almost could become an additional expense, right? Because I'm kind of doing the same things. But if you take a step back and you say, hey, how do we zone differently? Right? Like, how do we have people in very specific zones so that they're never going too far, but they're also never looking for a robot because they're being told where to go next, right? And so, then you're basically joining up the technology of the robots and having them in the right place at the right time so that they're able to accept the pick from that worker. And so it starts to impact, how do I zone my workers most effectively? How do I even slot my merchandise, right, my inventory in such a way that also I'm not overloading one zone or and underwhelming another. It was interesting when we first started getting into this realm. We actually have a mock warehouse that we've set up. So we have a 15,000 square foot facility actually just in Brampton, so just north of Toronto. And we were and this was back in like 2019, 2020, so a couple of years ago now. We started doing all sorts of experiments in terms of, hey, if we're going to look at how the logic impacts our customer environments, let's start looking at how that zoning plays a role, for example, and slotting and all these types of things. And we learned really quickly that we actually videotaped this one scenario, and one of the girls, the pickers, was almost running. And it was interesting because she was so overwhelmed, and it's human nature, which is also kind of an interesting attribute of AMRs. She would see an AMR sort of waiting for her, or two or three, and she'd almost start jogging, between them, trying to go faster. And meanwhile, I had two or three other people that were just sitting there doing nothing. And just to build out the rest of the story, we were using customer data, like actual. We had recreated an actual customer environment, and it became really clear that, well, wait a second, like, one person is working really hard and a lot of other people are more standing around. And so, the customer has to be open to a certain amount of operational change to actually be able to accommodate the automation most effectively. And the impacts of doing so are huge. They're profound, right? I mean, you could go from it being like maybe, 60% better than to what you had before to 200% better. And I mean, it's that kind of relative impact that we're talking about. And so I think those types of components are, extremely important to look at very specifically what kind of demand profile they have, where things are stored, and then where people are going to be working. That has a massive impact. And then, of course, when we think of just the warehouse design, there are some attributes that we're just going to need, of course, for automation. We're going to need certain aisle widths so that the AMRs have enough space to fit. We're going to need smooth floors and, more of those types of things. But I mean, that becomes a factor. And then one other thing I would add on top of all this, that is that picking workflow in isolation. No workflow in a distribution center works in isolation. There's an upfront, and there's sort of the process behind it. And it's really important to be looking at that whole operational flow, because if you don't, there's the opportunity for bottlenecks. And so it's fantastic, for example, let's say if you increase your picking by 2x, but then if all you've done is create a bottleneck at packout, you may actually not be any further ahead. In fact, you may in fact slow things down if you actually measure things by throughput. And so the other thing that we tend to encourage our customers is, like, let's look at this more holistically in terms of the impact and how we design this out, so that it's not actually going to have potentially an adverse reaction. You might say, oh, my units per hour, my lines per hour went up 300%, but my actual throughput out the door never changed.
Yeah.
Why? Right? So those types of things are very important.
Yeah. And that's a very interesting approach. I like that. Um, Now, you touched a bit upon this, but what are the challenges of automation and how should you overcome them?
So I think, one of the big challenges, and I touched on it before, is change management. People can often see these robotic solutions coming in and frankly see them as a bit of a threat. Is this thing coming to take my job versus is it coming to make my job easier? I was actually just at a conference last week, and SVP for DHL was up talking about some of their automation solutions, and he said, in some of their facilities, their people can walk up to 26 miles per day, literally like a marathon. And which is crazy to me. It seems like some of that could be better, but in any case, I was like, what was going through my mind though is even if you could knock 10% off that or 15% off that, how much would that be accepted by that worker? But that tends to be that human nature, right, of how people look at automation. Literally, there's a show called The Superstore that you may have seen, and it's a spoof on a major retailer. And in one of the episodes, they have a robot that comes in within the retail environment, and of course, almost every associate that sees this is initially thinking that that robot is there to take my job, right? And so um, I think the communication of this is here to make your job easier is really important, but also the entire user experience about the fact of actually living up to that making their job easier is also really important. And so I think that that overall change management piece can't be underestimated. So we all know that warehouses and distribution centers typically are notoriously slow in terms of bringing in new technologies, and we've seen this in the past from a Zebra standpoint. If you think of warehousing distribution centers using terminal emulation, right? So TE looks like a DOS prompt, and that's where workers are getting their instructions from. Not very user friendly. Often takes multiple weeks to actually get them trained to understand how to utilize that system. And then ironically, when we came in, because of our newer devices, with a graphical user interface that turned the command prompts into actual buttons and descriptions, workers had trouble with that, right? They were like, well, wait a minute, I knew what Control F5 did, but what is this next button actually bring me to?
Yeah.
Right? And so it's an interesting dynamic, and it does go to show though that change management piece is actually ultra important, because now we want them to be able to come in and actually see that this is making their job easier and it's not threatening. So I think that that change management aspect is probably one of the biggest pieces of advice that are challenges that organizations face, and they need to be very upfront in terms of understanding kind of like where they're going to potentially hit some challenges, and then what's the plan to overcome that. I think the other one, and I did touch on this before, is from a challenge standpoint, not considering the whole operation. You don't want to fix one thing to make another thing worse. And I think that's where early day exploration of some of these types of solutions, there was learning on that, right? In terms of, well, wait a second, we just completely swamped pack out. Or even at the induct phase of, how do we get these robots set up with the right totes and assigned so that they can go out and accept the right orders and all those types of things, but in an efficient way, right? Because in a static sense, you know what's supposed to go where, but what's the front end of that, right? And so how do you make sure that that's all working, as seamlessly and as smoothly, and not requiring the customer to actually hire more people, to actually, accommodate the bookends, if you will, like the front and the beginning of the workflow for that automation. And so, and I think a final, and it's kind of a challenge and an opportunity that I'll just mention, is I think, customers want to be able to extend the investments that they've already made.
Right.
And, this is a key one. So, from a Zebra standpoint, we have customers saying, so wait a second, like, so what do I do with these devices that I just bought last year or the year before? And I think, as I mentioned in that previous workflow example, we actually have the ability to incorporate those into that automation workflow in a way where, we can dynamically control the worker in a much more proactive way. They always know what to do next, in a sense, and really drive that broader investment so that they can leverage and continue to extend what they've already got in place. And that's not just for fulfillment, but even some of the other examples that I talked about, like, for example, the trash removal, or it might be material movement. Sometimes it's really an easy incorporation of that workflow by scanning a barcode or those types of things that can actually initiate that workflow. And so, I think it's, not, so the challenge is not throwing away investments that have already been made, but looking at creative ways for saying, hey, how can we even extend both that investment as well as the automation investment further?
Now, I know you had a webinar recently titled How Can You Take Advantage of Robotics Automation? And I was wondering if you could share a nugget or two for our viewers from this event.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably one of the biggest ones, and it's building off a point that I was just making previously in terms of like not all automation is fulfillment, right? When, some of that webinar was really focused on there's all sorts of opportunities for automation to come in and deliver an ROI, right? So it's not just that it's replacing a laborer, although at the same time, many of our ROI calculations actually do show that by bringing in that AMR to do some of these tasks, it is, from a financial standpoint, equivalent to replacing that worker. And so there is, often a very solid ROI within that. And so I think that was one of the things that was discussed, in some depth. But I think the other thing, from a nugget perspective, is automation doesn't always have to be rocket science. We see these robots running around, and it's really complex. One of the things that attracted us to Fetch, however, was the fact that they could take some of these really complex workflows, but simplify how you actually deploy them. And so they've built up a platform called Fetch Core that has some really interesting and compelling deployment capabilities. And for example, one customer that we were at, we actually, so to map a facility, we actually walk around with like a PlayStation controller, and you have one of our automation engineers that drives the AMR around the facility, and it automatically maps that facility out. So we were at a customer, and he came up to me and he said, "I thought you guys were going to map the facility," and I'm like, "Well, we did, right?" And he's like, "What do you mean you did?" He's like, "That was like a couple hours ago." And I'm like, "Well, guy finished about an hour ago," and so it took him about an hour to map the facility. And the reason I bring that up is because he had been experimenting with another automation vendor previously, and it took them 8 days. Right. And so there are some tools and some capabilities out there, and that's just the mapping. But there's some powerful workflow building tools for the simple, not for fulfillment, mind you, but for some of these material movement, like the trash removal, those types of things, or if I'm moving something from point to point, that can be set up in hours, right? Not weeks, not months of integration, those types of things. And so I think one of the other things that they talked about within that webinar was the fact that, hey, there are these opportunities. We've simplified the capability to be able to deploy them very efficiently, and they can be things that you can actually turn up and actually perhaps dip your toe into automation to even get comfortable with it before you start going to some of the more complex, like fulfillment type of applications, right, that will require more setup and integration to the back end and those types of things. But it allows our customers to kind of dip the toe. And actually, as an aside on that, that's something that we've been seeing growing in steam. Like, it's really been picking up from an interest standpoint with our customers and our partners as well, in terms of saying, hey, we're working on some of these sort of larger, more complex offerings over here, but suddenly we have a ton of these types of applications that we can do. And for example, one customer actually was specific to the trash removal. He's like, well, I actually have like 30 sites that this could be applicable for. It makes a ton of sense. Once I set it up once, I can just do it in each location, right? Very simply. So I think, it was those types of things that I think that webinar did an effective job of saying, hey, there's this other side of automation that can really work well.
I like the mapping, very cool stuff.
Yeah.
So, what do you think, in your opinion, what do the next 5 years look like in terms of warehousing trends in specifically distribution and 3PL?
Well, I wish I knew 5 years, but I think if we look at the immediate future, um, one of the things where workers will continue to be front and center. We truly believe that. There's talk of things like dark warehouses, and although some of that will happen, I think it will be to very specific types of environments and goods. As we talked about before, for let's say an ASRS, like an automatic storage and retrieval system, it's fantastic, but it can only do certain size and weight and those types of things, of goods. And so, and it has to be greenfield, right? Like typically those types of facilities are built versus retrofitted. And so, I think from our perspective, the workers will continue to be key. And a lot of the way that we're approaching automation is how do we continue to drive new capabilities, right, that actually empower the worker and give them more tools to be able to do their job. And I think when we look at it as well, and one thing I didn't mention before is, we've got automation, and when we've got our devices, for example, we can be controlling and informing a worker what to do with an AMR. But you also might have a worker that's with a manual pick cart. And for example, let's say you had an urgent order and one of our robots was dispatched to go get that urgent order. There's absolutely no reason why that same worker on the mobile pick cart couldn't step away and do a pick to the robot as well. And so I think from a flexibility perspective, customers are going to be looking for more answers, right? For, how do I actually scale my operations? Do I scale with robotics and automation? Do I scale with people? Right, and all these types of things. And I think over the next 5 years, they're going to be demanding more tools to be able to do that with, and more platforms. We have, a number of customers also interested in things like case picking, right? And so suddenly you need a very different platform on which you can fit a pallet, right? And, actually do heavy items onto that. But, they want to see automation throughout their facilities. But again, the facilities that they have today. And so I think that's one trend that they're going to want to continue to maximize the investments they've already made, and want to extend them further. And I think, the other side of that is, demand, I think, is going to do nothing but increase, right? I mean, COVID certainly spiked it in ways probably that, I'm not sure anyone really saw, just how profound that spike would in fact be, but I don't think it's going away, right? I mean, it was kind of funny. I remember my parents calling me up, and I mean, the first Amazon order, actually online order they ever did, was because they had been locked in their house for COVID. And so, you also see a different demographic coming in. So it's not just the people that were ordering now, it's new people that are ordering that are coming in. And so I think that's going to continue, and the labor shortage certainly isn't going to get any better as well. So I think these same foundational dynamics are just going to get stronger versus change fundamentally. And so it really is becoming our customers often are not looking to eliminate; they're just looking to like eliminate labor, right? Because they're saying I can't find enough. They're just saying, hey, how do you get me to the capacity that I really need? And the final thing is that I touched on this earlier as well, is I think in the next 5 years, the customer expectation is just going to profoundly get, more demanding, if you will, right? It's, now if you can't give me an estimated time of my delivery, I might shop elsewhere. If that estimated time of delivery is too long, I might shop elsewhere. Everybody can Google and find that item that they're looking for. And hey, this vendor was going to be 4 days, and this one's now going to be two. I'm going to go there. And so for the, especially for a 3PL, for them to be able to attract customers, right, and for them to be able to deliver on, SLAs that their customers are probably going to increasingly expect, they're going to be looking more and more to this type of technology.
Lastly, what is the one piece of advice you can give a large or mid market distributor of 3PL that wants to improve their supply chain operations leveraging technology, whether it be hardware or software?
Yeah, I mean, it probably goes back a bit. Don't look at anything in isolation. Um, you know, you can absolutely deploy something, right, as a single solution at a given time, right? Because often these things will be phased. Typically things can't be deployed or complete facility overhauled all at once. But the biggest piece of advice I would say is, consider the front end and back end of any given automation solution that you're putting in to make sure that you're not creating, you know, different or potentially negatively impacting issues elsewhere in the operation. And that would be, if it was sort of like one big piece of advice, that would be, I think the one to take a look at.
Todd, thank you very much for your insights today. This has been a valuable Texas in Conversation interview. And thank you to our viewers. If you need support with introducing automation within your warehouse, Texas is here to help. At the end of this video, you have the option to speak to one of our supply chain experts or access our infographic, Warehouse Automation 101. Thank you for watching, and again, thank you, Todd.
Cool. Thank you.